Picture a newly proclaimed Roman emperor standing before thousands of armed soldiers, knowing that his survival depends not on his lineage, not on senatorial approval, but on the bags of gold and silver coins about to be distributed to every man in that crowd, soldiers who could just as easily kill him as acclaim him if the payment falls short of expectations. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to explore how Roman emperors had to pay their soldiers massive cash bonuses called donatives to secure loyalty, discover why troops expected these gifts whenever a new emperor took the throne, understand how the Praetorian Guard essentially auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder, and learn what military economics, political corruption, and the dangerous game of buying an army's loyalty reveal about the true nature of Roman imperial power. The Roman Empire was at its core a military state. The legions conquered the Mediterranean world, defended the frontiers, and, crucially, decided who would rule. An emperor who lost the army's support was an emperor who would soon be dead, and nothing secured that support more reliably than cold, hard cash. The donativum, as the Romans called it, was a cash bonus given to soldiers on special occasions, most importantly when a new emperor took the throne. It was expected, it was enormous, and failing to pay it could be fatal. The word donativum comes from the Latin donare, meaning to give or to present. In its simplest form, a donative was a gift, but calling it a gift obscures its true nature. This was not voluntary generosity, it was a political necessity, a transaction that bound emperor and army together. The soldiers gave their loyalty and their swords. The emperor gave them money. Both sides understood the terms of this arrangement, and both sides knew the consequences of breaking it. To understand how donatives became so central to Roman politics, we need to go back to the Republic, long before there were emperors at all. Roman soldiers in the early and middle Republic were citizen soldiers, men who served when called upon and returned to their farms when the fighting was done. They were not professionals, and they were not paid a regular salary. War was a civic duty, not a career. This changed dramatically in the late Republic. As Rome's wars became longer and more distant, as campaigns stretched on for years in Spain or Gaul or the East, the old citizen militia became impractical. Rome needed professional soldiers who would serve for extended periods, and professional soldiers needed to be paid. The introduction of regular military pay, the stipendium, transformed the Roman army. But it also created a new dynamic, soldiers who depended on their commanders for their livelihood. The great generals of the late Republic understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. Gaius Marius, who reformed the Roman army in the late 2nd century BCE, recruited soldiers from the landless poor, men who had nothing to return to after their service, and who depended entirely on their general for their future. Marius rewarded his veterans with land grants and cash bonuses, creating a loyal following that owed its prosperity to him personally, not to the Roman state. Lucius Cornelius Sulla followed the same path. After his wars in the East, Sulla rewarded his soldiers lavishly, distributing the spoils of conquest among his loyal troops. When Sulla marched on Rome itself, twice, his soldiers followed him because he had made them rich and promised to make them richer still. The personal bond between commander and army, sealed with money, had become stronger than loyalty to the Republic. Julius Caesar perfected this system. During his years in Gaul, Caesar shared the spoils of conquest generously with his legions. He paid bonuses for exceptional service, gave gifts to celebrate victories, and promised even greater rewards when the fighting was done. His soldiers adored him, and when he crossed the Rubicon to start a civil war, they followed without hesitation. Caesar's army was his army, loyal to him personally because he had made them partners in his success. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, his will revealed that he had left money to every Roman citizen, but also substantial sums to his soldiers. The pattern was set: a leader's death should mean a payday for the troops. Caesar's heir Octavian, the future Augustus, understood this lesson well. He would use money to build the most loyal army Rome had ever seen. Augustus, who became Rome's first emperor after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra, institutionalized the donative system. He understood that his power rested on the army, and he ensured that the army knew it was appreciated. Augustus established a military treasury, the Aerarium Militare, funded by a tax on inheritances, specifically to provide for soldiers' bonuses and retirement payments. He regularized military pay, set clear terms of service, and, crucially, established the expectation that emperors would pay donatives on their accession. In his will, Augustus left specific sums to the Praetorian Guard and to the legions. The Praetorians, the emperor's personal bodyguard stationed in Rome itself, received 250 denarii each, about 10 months' pay. The regular legionaries received less, but still substantial amounts. By specifying these payments in his will, Augustus created a precedent that his successors would be expected to follow. A new emperor should pay the soldiers for their loyalty, and the Praetorians, stationed closest to the centre of power, should receive the most. The amounts involved in donatives could be staggering. A single payment might equal months or even years of regular salary. When the Emperor Claudius was acclaimed by the Praetorian Guard in 41 CE, he promised each guardsman 15,000 sesterces, the equivalent of about 5 years' pay. This was an extraordinary sum, but Claudius was in an extraordinary situation. The Praetorians had literally plucked him from behind a curtain after assassinating his nephew Caligula and made him emperor. He owed them everything, and he paid accordingly. The story of Claudius's accession illustrates the dangerous power of the donative system. When Caligula was murdered, the Senate hoped to restore the Republic, or at least to choose the next emperor themselves. But the Praetorian Guard had other ideas. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man no one had considered a serious candidate for power, and acclaimed him emperor. They brought him to their barracks, protected him from the Senate's machinations, and presented the city with a fait accompli. Claudius had no choice but to reward this loyalty with the largest donative ever given. The message was clear. The Praetorians could make emperors, and emperors would pay for the privilege. Nero's accession in 54 CE followed a similar pattern, though less dramatic. When Claudius died, probably poisoned by his wife Agrippina, the young Nero was presented to the Praetorian Guard as the new emperor. He promised each guardsman the same amount Claudius had given, establishing the expectation that accession donatives would remain at this elevated level. Nero understood that his position depended on the Praetorians' goodwill, and he paid to secure it. The year of 4 emperors in 69 CE demonstrated just how completely money had come to dominate imperial politics. When Nero committed suicide, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended, and the empire descended into civil war. Galba, an elderly senator and general, was acclaimed emperor first, but Galba made a fatal mistake. He refused to pay the expected donative. He reportedly declared that he was accustomed to levying soldiers, not buying them, a noble sentiment that cost him his life. The Praetorians, outraged at being denied their expected payment, transferred their allegiance to Otho, who promised lavish rewards. Galba was murdered in the Roman Forum, his head paraded through the streets. Otho lasted only 3 months before being defeated by Vitellius, who had secured the loyalty of the Rhine legions with his own promises of payment, and Vitellius in turn fell to Vespasian, who had the support of the eastern legions and, crucially, control of Egypt's grain supply and tax revenues. The chaos of 69 CE demonstrated that imperial power was, in the final analysis, for sale. The legions would follow whoever paid them the most, or at least whoever seemed most likely to pay. Senators, ancient lineage, constitutional legitimacy, none of this mattered as much as the ability to satisfy the soldiers' expectations. Vespasian, who emerged victorious and founded the Flavian dynasty, understood this reality. He paid his troops well and never forgot who had put him on the throne. The most infamous example of the donative system's corruption came in 193 CE, when the Praetorian Guard literally auctioned off the empire. The Emperor Pertinax, who had tried to restore fiscal discipline after the excesses of Commodus, was murdered by the Praetorians after only 86 days in power. He had failed to pay the full donative he had promised, and the guards killed him for it. What happened next shocked even the cynical Romans. The Praetorians announced that they would sell the empire to the highest bidder. 2 candidates emerged: Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's father-in-law, and Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator. The two men stood outside the Praetorian barracks and literally bid against each other, each promising larger and larger sums to the soldiers inside. Didius Julianus won by promising 25,000 sesterces to each guardsman, an astronomical sum equivalent to nearly 8 years' pay. The historian Cassius Dio, who lived through these events, described the scene with disgust. The empire was being auctioned off as if at an auction room. Didius Julianus entered the Praetorian camp, was acclaimed emperor, and marched to the Senate to receive their reluctant endorsement. But his reign was doomed from the start. He had bought the throne, and everyone knew it. The provincial armies, outraged at the Praetorians' behaviour, raised their own candidates. Within 66 days, Didius Julianus was dead, executed by a soldier sent by Septimius Severus, who had marched on Rome with the legions of the Danube. Septimius Severus dealt with the Praetorian Guard harshly. He disbanded the existing unit and replaced it with soldiers from his own legions, but he did not abolish the donative system. He could not. The army was his power base, and he paid it accordingly. Enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, he supposedly advised his sons on his deathbed. Whether or not he actually said this, it accurately described the political reality of the Roman Empire. The amounts paid in donatives increased over time, as each new emperor tried to match or exceed his predecessor's generosity. Inflation, political instability, and the increasing frequency of succession crises all drove payments upward. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was in constant crisis, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession, each needing to buy the army's support with ever larger payments. The economic strain was enormous. The imperial treasury, the fiscus, could rarely afford the payments that soldiers expected. Emperors resorted to various expedients to meet their obligations. They debased the coinage, reducing the silver content of Roman coins so that more coins could be minted from the same amount of metal. They confiscated the property of wealthy citizens on trumped-up charges of treason. They raised taxes to crushing levels. They delayed payments to other creditors. Everything was subordinated to the need to pay the army. The debasement of Roman coinage is visible in the archaeological record. Denarii from the time of Augustus contained about 95% silver. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, silver content had dropped to about 75%. By the mid-3rd century, the silver denarius contained only about 5% silver. It was essentially a bronze coin with a silver wash. This debasement caused inflation, which in turn increased pressure to raise military pay, which required more debasement. It was a vicious cycle that contributed to the economic crisis of the 3rd century. The logistics of actually distributing donatives were complex. Thousands of soldiers, stationed across an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, expected to receive their payments. The coins had to be minted, transported, and distributed fairly. Officers oversaw the process, keeping records of who had received what. Military standards, the eagles and signa that each unit carried, were decorated for the occasion, and the distribution often became a ceremony affirming the bond between emperor and army. Soldiers lined up to receive their coins, typically in person from the emperor himself when possible, or from his representatives when distance made personal distribution impossible. The physical act of receiving money from the emperor's hand, or from someone representing the emperor, reinforced the personal nature of the bond. This was not an anonymous bureaucratic transaction. It was a direct exchange between ruler and soldier, a reaffirmation of mutual obligation. The coins themselves carried political messages. Imperial coins bore the emperor's portrait, his titles, and propaganda messages about his achievements. When soldiers received their donatives, they received not just money but images of their emperor, reminders of who was paying them and why they should be loyal. The coins circulated through the economy, spreading the emperor's image across the empire. Numismatic propaganda was an important tool of imperial communication. Not all Romans approved of the donative system. Conservative writers looked back nostalgically to the days when citizen soldiers fought for Rome out of patriotic duty, not mercenary self-interest. They criticized the corruption they saw in their own times, when soldiers followed whoever paid them the most, regardless of that leader's legitimacy or character. The historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, presented the donative system as symptomatic of Rome's moral decline. But these critics offered no practical alternative. The professional army was essential to Rome's defence, and professional soldiers needed to be paid. The old citizen militia could never be restored. Rome's wars were too distant, too long, and too demanding for part-time soldiers. The donative system, whatever its corrupting effects, was a political reality that emperors had to accept. The relationship between donatives and regular military pay, the stipendium, deserves clarification. The stipendium was a soldier's regular salary paid 3 times a year. A legionary in the early empire earned about 900 sesterces annually, from which deductions were made for food, equipment, and a burial fund. This regular pay was supplemented by occasional donatives on special occasions: the emperor's accession, major victories, imperial birthdays and anniversaries, and similar events. Donatives were thus bonus payments on top of regular salary, not replacements for it, but the amounts could be so large that they dwarfed regular pay. A soldier who received a donative of 5 years' salary was suddenly wealthy beyond anything his regular wages could provide. These windfalls created intense expectations among the troops and intense pressure on emperors to deliver. The political message of donatives was complex. On one hand, they demonstrated the emperor's generosity and his care for his soldiers. A generous emperor was a good emperor, worthy of loyalty and devotion. The distribution ceremony itself was a public affirmation of the emperor's relationship with his troops, a ritual that bound them together. On the other hand, donatives revealed an uncomfortable truth. Imperial power was in some sense for sale. The emperor who paid the most got the most loyalty. This mercenary quality troubled Roman traditionalists, who preferred to imagine a nobler relationship between ruler and ruled. But it was also deeply practical. In a world without modern financial systems, direct cash payments were the most effective way to maintain loyalty across a vast empire. The consequences of failing to pay adequate donatives were severe and immediate. Galba's fate was the most dramatic example, but there were others. Emperors who tried to economize on military pay, who delayed payments or who promised more than they could deliver, risked mutiny, assassination, or both. The soldiers had learned that they could make and unmake emperors, and they were not shy about exercising that power. Civil wars often began with competing donative promises. When Septimius Severus marched on Rome in 193 CE, he promised his soldiers enormous rewards. When Pescennius Niger and Clodius Albinus challenged him, they made their own promises. The civil war that followed was in part a bidding war for military support. The winner would be whoever could credibly promise the largest payments and then actually deliver them. The Praetorian Guard occupied a special position in the donative system. Stationed in Rome itself, the Praetorians were the only significant military force in the capital. They guarded the emperor's person, controlled access to the palace, and could determine who lived and who died at the centre of power. Their donatives were always larger than those paid to the provincial legions, reflecting their greater political importance. The Praetorians knew their power, and used it. They murdered Caligula, and made Claudius. They murdered Pertinax, and sold the empire to Didius Julianus. They could protect an emperor, or destroy him, depending on how well he satisfied their expectations. For centuries, the Praetorian Guard was the most dangerous institution in Rome. Dangerous to emperors, dangerous to rivals, dangerous to anyone who stood between them and their money. Constantine I finally dissolved the Praetorian Guard in 312 CE, after they had backed his rival Maxentius. But the dissolution of the Praetorians did not end the donative system. Constantine and his successors continued to pay bonuses to their troops, now organized in different units, but still expecting the same rewards. The pattern established by Augustus continued until the end of the Western Roman Empire and beyond. The late Roman army received regular donatives on imperial anniversaries, typically every 5 years. These quinquennial donatives became a scheduled expectation, adding to the already heavy burden on the imperial treasury. The amounts varied with the emperor's resources and generosity, but the expectation was constant. Soldiers who did not receive their expected payments might vote with their swords, transferring their allegiance to whoever would pay. Looking at the Roman donative system from a modern perspective, we might see parallels to contemporary military compensation. Modern armed forces offer enlistment bonuses, retention bonuses, combat pay, and various other special payments designed to attract and keep qualified personnel. The logic is similar to the Roman donative: extra money to secure and maintain loyalty, to recognize the special demands of military service, and to compete for scarce human resources. Of course, there are important differences. Modern democracies have civilian control of the military, constitutional limits on military involvement in politics, and financial systems that separate military pay from the personal largesse of individual leaders. Roman emperors had none of these protections. Their power depended directly on their ability to pay their troops, and their troops knew it. The Roman donative system reveals several important truths about the nature of power. First, power is expensive. Maintaining the loyalty of thousands of armed men required enormous resources, and those resources had to be continuously replenished. An emperor who ran out of money would soon run out of support. Second, power is personal. Despite the institutions of Roman government, the Senate, the provincial administrators, the courts, real power resided in the personal relationship between emperor and army. The donative system made this personal relationship explicit and visible. Every soldier who received coins from the emperor's hand understood that his fortune depended on this particular ruler, not on some abstract institution. Third, power is precarious. The same soldiers who acclaimed one emperor could murder him and acclaim another. The donative system kept power perpetually unstable, dependent on continuous payments that might become unaffordable. Every emperor lived with the knowledge that his soldiers might decide someone else was a better investment. The Roman donative system shaped Roman history in profound ways. It contributed to the chronic instability of the empire, as emperors rose and fell based on their ability to satisfy military expectations. It drained the imperial treasury, forcing emperors into debasement and confiscation. It subordinated all other interests, senatorial, civilian, provincial, to the demands of the army, and it created a political culture in which violence and money were the ultimate arbiters of power. When we read about Roman emperors, we often focus on their personalities, their achievements, their vices. But underlying all of these individual stories was a structural reality. The emperor was, in effect, the chief paymaster of the army, and his survival depended on keeping those payments flowing. The donative system was the hidden engine of Roman imperial politics, the mechanism that made and unmade emperors for 500 years. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE by Odoacer, a barbarian general. The circumstances of his fall are somewhat murky, but money was certainly involved. The Roman army in Italy had become dependent on barbarian mercenaries, and those mercenaries wanted land and payment that the weakened Western government could no longer provide. When Odoacer offered better terms, the soldiers abandoned their emperor. Even at the end, the logic of the donative system held. Soldiers followed whoever paid them. The donative system was not unique to Rome, though the Romans developed it to an extraordinary degree. Armies throughout history have demanded their share of the spoils, have transferred their loyalty to generous commanders, have made and unmade rulers based on material considerations. The Roman experience simply illustrates with unusual clarity the eternal tension between military power and political authority, between the need to defend a state and the danger of the defenders becoming the masters. Understanding the donative system helps us understand Rome more fully. The empire was not simply a story of great men and grand achievements. It was also a story of money, of the constant struggle to find enough coins to pay enough soldiers to maintain enough stability to govern a vast and diverse territory. The gold and silver that flowed from the emperor's treasury to the soldiers' hands was the lifeblood of Roman power, and when it stopped flowing, the empire died. The coins that survive from ancient Rome, scattered through museums and private collections around the world, are physical evidence of this system. Each aureus and denarius was once part of the great mechanism of Roman power, passing from treasury to soldier to merchant to the archaeological record. When we hold these coins, we hold fragments of the donative system, tangible connections to the payments that kept emperors on their thrones and legions in the field. The Roman donative system teaches us that power has a price, that loyalty can be bought, and that the relationship between rulers and soldiers is always at some level transactional. These lessons remain relevant today in any society that maintains a professional military. The Romans discovered, through centuries of experience, that you cannot have a standing army without paying for it, and that the army you pay may eventually decide that it deserves a bigger share or a different employer. Sit with that thought for a moment. Every Roman emperor, from Augustus to Romulus or Gustulus, woke up each day knowing that his life depended on keeping his soldiers satisfied. The donative was not a gift freely given. It was tribute paid to power, protection money extracted by the very forces that were supposed to protect the empire. In the end, the Roman army protected itself first, the empire second, and the emperor only as long as he was useful. The bags of gold and silver that changed hands at each imperial accession were not symbols of generosity. They were the price of survival in a world where military force was the ultimate source of power, and everyone knew it.